Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys start in the unlikeliest places. Meet Mason Clark, a young man whose world seems stacked against him. In a neighborhood where opportunities are scarce, and every day feels like a struggle, Mason dreams of a better life, not just for himself, but for his family. But how does someone rise when the odds seem impossible? Along the way, Mason faces relentless challenges, from school bullies and family hardships to the daunting task of proving he's capable of greatness. With the guidance of an unlikely mentor, the unwavering love of his mother, and the memory of his father's courage, Mason's journey becomes a powerful testament to resilience, hope, and the strength we all have to rise above adversity. Will Mason be able to overcome his fears, rise above his circumstances, and achieve the dream he's been fighting for? Stay tuned for this heartfelt and gripping story of determination and growth. And before we dive in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts as Mason's story unfolds, so let us know in the comments what inspires you most. The air was heavy as Mason Clark walked home from school, his worn sneakers scuffing against the cracked pavement. The late afternoon sun pressed down on the neighborhood like a weight, casting long shadows over the peeling paint and sagging porches. Mason adjusted his patched-up backpack, which had seen better days long before it became his. He tried not to think about what waited for him at home: an empty fridge, another overdue bill, and his little sister's hopeful smile. His street was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a passing car. As Mason approached the familiar sight of his house, a small, single-story structure with a sagging roof, he spotted their neighbor, Mrs. Andrews, watering her wilting flowers. She glanced up and offered him a tight-lipped smile. "Hey there, Mason. School okay today?" she asked. Mason nodded, forcing a smile in return. "Yeah, it was fine." She looked like she wanted to say more, but didn't. He knew that look. It was the same one most adults gave him, sympathetic but hesitant, like they were unsure if he wanted their pity. Pushing open the front door, Mason was greeted by the faint smell of cleaning detergent and the soft hum of the old refrigerator, which often struggled to stay cold. His mother, Joanna, was in the kitchen, her back turned as she scrubbed the counter. Her uniform from the diner was wrinkled, and strands of her dark hair had escaped her ponytail. "Mason, is that you?" she called over her shoulder. "Yeah, Ma, it's me." Joanna turned, a tired smile gracing her face. Her hands were red from hours of scrubbing, and the dark circles under her eyes seemed even more pronounced today. "Dinner'll be ready soon." "Nothing fancy, just spaghetti," she said, her voice light but strained. Mason nodded, his stomach tightening. He knew spaghetti meant the last of the pasta and canned tomato sauce she'd scraped together. It wasn't much, but Joanna always made it feel like enough. "Where's Emily?" Mason asked, glancing toward the small bedroom they shared. "Drawing, I think," Joanna replied, turning back to her task. "She's been talking about some superhero she's making up. Said it's based on you." Mason's chest tightened, warmth and guilt mixing in equal measure. Emily was always drawing superheroes, but it hurt to think she saw him as one when he could barely keep his own head above water. In their shared room, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around her. She looked up as Mason entered, her face lighting up. "Hey, Maze! Look," she exclaimed, holding up her latest drawing. A caped superhero with a big M on his chest stood tall, hands on his hips, a smile that could take on the world. "It's you!" Emily beamed. Mason smiled, ruffling her hair. "I don't know if superheroes are this tired." Emily giggled, not deterred. "You are to me." As much as her words warmed him, they also weighed on him. He didn't feel like a superhero. He felt like a kid barely holding things together. Later that night, Mason lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old pipes. Joanna's muffled voice carried from the kitchen, where she was on the phone with the electric company, trying to negotiate a payment plan. The stress in her voice was palpable. Mason rolled onto his side, his eyes landing on the framed photo of his father on the nightstand. Andrew Clark stood in uniform, a proud smile on his face. Mason couldn't remember much about him. He had been too young when his father was deployed. All he knew were the stories Joanna used to tell before she stopped talking about him altogether. Think I could be like him one day? Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily stirred in her sleep, but didn't wake. Mason clenched his jaw, the question lingering in the air with no answer. The next morning, Mason trudged to school, dreading what awaited him. Bryce Tucker and his group of friends were already at their usual spot near the lockers, their voices loud and mocking. Mason tried to slip past unnoticed, but Bryce's sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Hey, Clark, those shoes still holding together? Or are they ready for the dumpster?" The laughter from the group stung, but Mason kept his eyes on the floor, refusing to engage. He knew better than to give Bryce the satisfaction. As Mason reached his locker, Bryce shoved him lightly from behind, making him stumble. "Still think you're joining the military? They don't take losers, Clark." Mason's hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Fighting back wouldn't solve anything, it would only get him into trouble. The rest of the day dragged on, each class blurring into the next. By the time Mason got home, his frustration had boiled over, but he didn't let it show. Emily was at the kitchen table, coloring, and Joanna was folding laundry. He didn't want to add to their worries. "Mason, we need to talk," Joanna said as he dropped his bag by the door. Her tone was serious, and Mason felt a pit form in his stomach. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting across from her. Joanna sighed, her hands resting on the table. "The electric bill, it's due in 3 days. I'm doing everything I can, but I don't know if we'll make it this time." Mason looked away, guilt and helplessness gnawing at him. He wanted to fix everything, to ease her burden, but he didn't know how. "We'll figure it out, Ma," he said, though the words fell hollow. Joanna nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "I know, baby. I just wish things were easier." The next afternoon, as Mason walked home from school, he noticed a man in a wheelchair struggling to get up a cracked ramp. His hands shook as he tried to push himself forward, but the wheels kept catching. Mason hesitated for only a moment before jogging over. "Hey, sir, let me help you." The man looked up, startled but relieved. "Thanks, kid. These ramps are tougher than they look." Mason grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, carefully guiding it up the incline. Once at the top, the man turned to him with a grateful smile. "You're a good boy," he said. "Not many like you these days." Mason gave a small shrug. "No problem. Just glad I could help." The man introduced himself as Walter Price, a veteran who lived a few streets over. Mason didn't think much of the interaction. It felt like the right thing to do. But as he walked away, he felt a little lighter, like he'd done something that mattered. The following morning, Mason was brushing his teeth when Emily ran into the bathroom, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mason, there's a limo outside," she exclaimed. Confused, Mason followed her to the front door. Sure enough, a sleek black limousine was parked in front of their house, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, curiosity written all over their faces. The door to the limo opened, and out stepped Walter Price, followed by a tall man in a suit. Walter smiled, gesturing for Mason to come closer. "Mason," Walter called. "This is Benjamin Cross. He's a friend of mine." Benjamin extended a hand, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "Mason, it's a pleasure to meet you. Walter told me about what you did for him. I'd like to offer some help to you and your family." Mason froze, unsure how to respond. Joanna stepped onto the porch, her expression wary but intrigued. "What kind of help?" Mason asked cautiously. "Financial assistance," Benjamin said, "and an opportunity to prepare for the future. I've helped kids like you before, kids with potential." Mason's face flushed. "I don't know. We're okay. We don't need charity." Joanna's face tightened, and she looked like she wanted to protest, but she held her tongue. Benjamin nodded, understanding but firm. "If you change your mind, let me know," he said, handing a card to Joanna. As the limo drove away, Mason felt the weight of his pride pressing down on him. He wanted to be strong, like the superhero Emily saw him as. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice. Mason stared at the card Benjamin Cross had given Joanna. It sat on the kitchen counter like a glaring reminder of his decision. He could feel Joanna's eyes on him as he picked at the remnants of his spaghetti dinner. Mason, she said softly but firmly. Why'd you say no? He looked up at her, guilt tightening his chest. Ma, I don't want people thinking we can't make it on our own. Bryce and his friends already give me enough grief at school. This'll just make it worse. Joanna's brow furrowed, and her voice trembled slightly. Baby, this isn't about pride or what those boys say. This is about getting through, about giving you and Emily a chance at something better. Mason dropped his fork, the clang echoing in the quiet room. I don't want charity, Ma. I don't want to feel like I owe someone for every step I take. Joanna's shoulders slumped, and she turned away, washing dishes with quick, frustrated movements. Your father would have taken the help, she said after a long pause. He knew there were times when standing alone wasn't the strongest thing you could do. Mason didn't respond. Instead, he excused himself and went to his room. Emily was already asleep, her superhero drawing pinned to the wall above her bed. Mason sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the picture of their father in uniform. Would you have taken it? He whispered to the photo, his voice cracking. The next morning, the tension lingered. Joanna gave him a quiet goodbye as he left for school, and Mason couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. As he walked down the street, he replayed their conversation in his head. Was he wrong? Was it selfish to let his pride get in the way of his family's needs? The school day passed in a blur of lectures, assignments, and the usual sneers from Bryce Tucker. Mason avoided him and his friends, focusing instead on his classes. But their laughter followed him in the hallways, like an invisible weight he couldn't shake. On his way home, Mason stopped by the local park. He wasn't ready to go back to the silence and tension of the house. Sitting on a worn bench, he watched as younger kids played on the rusted swings and slides. Their laughter felt distant, almost like it belonged to another world. Hey, Mason, a familiar voice called out. Mason turned to see Walter Price approaching, his wheelchair moving steadily across the uneven path. Mason stood up, instinctively offering to help, but Walter waved him off. I got it, kid. These old wheels still work fine, Walter said with a grin. He stopped in front of Mason, his eyes narrowing slightly. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. Mason shrugged, kicking at a loose pebble on the ground. It's nothing. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. Let me guess. That card Cross gave you? It's burning a hole in your mom's kitchen, isn't it? Mason stiffened but didn't answer. Walter didn't seem to need one. I know it's hard, kid, Walter said, his tone softening. Accepting help can feel like admitting you're weak. But let me tell you something, nobody does it alone. Not in life, not in the military, not anywhere that matters. Mason frowned. But doesn't it mean I'm failing if I can't do it on my own? Walter leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. Not even close. It means you're smart enough to know when to reach out. That's courage. Mason, not letting your pride keep you from what you need. The words hung in the air, and Mason found himself staring at his shoes, thinking about what Walter had said. Could asking for help really be a strength instead of a weakness? That night, Mason lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Emily snored softly in the bed next to his, clutching her stuffed bear. The sound was comforting, but it didn't quiet the storm of thoughts in Mason's mind. He got up and tiptoed to the living room, where Joanna was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red but her smile soft. Can't sleep? She asked. Mason shook his head, sitting down across from her. No. Joanna reached into a small wooden box on the table, pulling out a worn envelope. She slid it across to Mason, her expression unreadable. I think it's time you read this. Mason hesitated before opening the envelope, his fingers trembling. Inside was a letter written in his father's neat handwriting. Dear Mason, if you're reading this, I'm not around to tell you these things myself. That's hard for me to write, because there's so much I wanted to say to you as you grew up. But if there's one thing I need you to know, it's this. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about what you do when you're scared. There were so many moments in my life where I doubted myself, where I thought I wasn't strong enough. But I learned that strength isn't about going it alone. The strongest thing you can do sometimes is reach out, ask for help, and trust the people who care about you. Mason, you're going to face challenges I can't imagine. But I know you'll overcome them because you've got a heart full of kindness. And that's what makes a hero. You don't have to do it alone. You've got your mom, your sister, and people who care about you. Don't let pride keep you from the help you need to achieve great things. I love you, son. Be strong, but don't be afraid to lean on others. Love, Dad. Mason's vision blurred as he finished the letter. Joanna reached across the table, squeezing his hand. Your dad believed in you, Mason. He knew how hard life can be, but he also knew you could handle it. You just have to let people in. Mason nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The letter felt like a lifeline, a reminder that he didn't have to bear the weight of everything alone. The next morning, Mason woke up before dawn. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He pulled on his worn sneakers and stepped outside, the cool morning air biting at his skin. He started running, his feet pounding against the pavement in a steady rhythm. Each step felt like a small act of defiance against the doubt and fear that had held him back. By the time the sun began to rise, Mason was back home, sweat dripping down his face, but a new determination in his chest. Joanna was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked up as he walked in, her expression wary. "Ma," Mason said, his voice steady. "I think I need to call Mr. Cross." Joanna's face softened, and tears filled her eyes. She crossed the room, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Mason hugged her back, feeling the weight of his pride finally lifting. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was ready to face it with help. The phone call wasn't as hard as Mason had feared. Benjamin Cross's voice was warm and calm on the other end of the line, and he didn't sound surprised when Mason said he'd reconsidered the offer. "I'm glad to hear from you, Mason," Benjamin said. "This isn't just about what I can do for you, it's about what you can achieve. Let's meet tomorrow to go over the next steps." The conversation was short, but filled with possibilities. Mason hung up feeling both nervous and hopeful. Joanna, standing nearby with her hands clasped, looked relieved. The next day, Mason and Joanna met Benjamin at the local diner. Benjamin brought along Walter Price, whose easy smile and warm greeting put Mason at ease. Over plates of pancakes and eggs, Benjamin laid out a plan. Tutoring sessions at the community center to improve Mason's grades, access to fitness training programs, and mentorship from Walter to help guide him toward the military prep program. Mason hesitated. "Are you sure I'm the right person for this? There are probably kids out there who deserve it more." Walter laughed, his deep voice cutting through Mason's doubt. "Kid, deserving isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to put in the work. I've seen enough of you to know you've got what it takes." Benjamin nodded. "We're not looking for perfect, Mason. We're looking for someone with the drive to keep going when things get tough. You've already shown that." Mason glanced at Joanna. She gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes brimming with pride. He took a deep breath and nodded back at Benjamin. "Okay, I'm in." Mason woke up the next morning before the sun had risen. His runs had become a daily ritual, a way to clear his mind and prepare for the challenges ahead. But this morning felt different. He wasn't running to escape his doubts, he was running towards something. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers on the pavement and the occasional chirp of early birds. As he rounded the corner near the park, he saw Walter sitting on a bench, his cane resting beside him. "You're up early," Walter called out as Mason slowed to a stop. "Guess I've got a lot to work on," Mason replied, catching his breath. Walter chuckled. "Good. Work is what separates dreamers from doers." They talked for a while, Walter sharing stories from his military days about the camaraderie, the discipline, and the moments when he doubted himself but kept pushing forward. Mason soaked it all in, inspired by Walter's resilience and honesty. "You don't have to do it all at once, kid," Walter said as Mason stood to leave. "One step at a time, that's how you get anywhere worth going." The community center wasn't anything fancy, just a small building with chipped paint and a cheerful banner that read, "After-school programs for a better tomorrow." But as Mason stepped inside, he felt something shift. This wasn't just about the help being offered, it was about what he was willing to give back in return. At a table near the back, Ms. Parker, a kind-faced woman in her mid-30s, was sorting through textbooks. She looked up and smiled when she saw Mason. "You must be Mason Clark," she said, standing to shake his hand. "I've heard good things about you." Mason flushed and used to praise. "Thanks. I guess I've got a lot to learn." Ms. Parker nodded. "That's what I'm here for. Let's get started." For the next hour, Mason worked through math problems that had always felt impossible. Ms. Parker was patient, breaking down each step until it finally started to click. By the time they finished, Mason felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. "That was great, Mason," Ms. Parker said as he packed up his things. "Keep at it, and you'll surprise yourself." As Mason walked home, he replayed her words in his head. He didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to keep trying. The next day at school, Mason felt lighter. For once, he wasn't dreading the day ahead. But his optimism was quickly tested when he saw Bryce Tucker leaning against his locker, arms crossed and a smug grin on his face. "Hey, Clark," Bryce called out as Mason approached. "Heard you've got some fancy new tutors. What's that about? Trying to buy your way into the military now?" Mason clenched his jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. "I'm just doing what I need to do," he said, keeping his voice steady. Bryce snorted. "What you need to do is realize you're wasting everyone's time. Guys like you don't make it anywhere." Before Mason could respond, a quiet voice spoke up from nearby. "Leave him alone, Bryce." Mason turned to see Chris, one of Bryce's friends, standing a few feet away. Chris avoided Mason's gaze, but his words hung in the air, silencing Bryce for a moment. Bryce sneered. "Whatever. Let's go." As Bryce walked away, Chris lingered for a moment before nodding at Mason. It wasn't much, but it felt like a crack in the wall of Bryce's dominance. Mason spent the rest of the day focused on his classes, ignoring the whispers and stares. He was starting to understand that his value didn't depend on what others thought of him, it depended on what he thought of himself. That evening, as he ran through the neighborhood, Mason felt a newfound determination. Bryce could say whatever he wanted, but Mason wasn't going to let anyone hold him back. Mason's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., filling the small room he shared with Emily. He reached over to turn it off before it woke her. The house was silent, the world outside still dark, but Mason was determined. He laced up his worn sneakers, grabbed his hoodie, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The first few minutes of his run were the hardest, his legs aching and his lungs burning as he pushed himself forward. But as he rounded the first corner, his body began to find its rhythm. Mason focused on the sound of his footsteps and the steady beat of his heart. Walter's advice echoed in his mind, one step at a time. When he reached the park, Mason saw Walter sitting on his usual bench. Walter raised a hand in greeting, his cane resting by his side. "Thought I'd see you here," Walter called as Mason slowed to a stop. "You're looking steadier today." Mason grinned, catching his breath. "Still feels tough." Walter chuckled. "Good. Means you're getting stronger." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun begin to rise over the rooftops. Finally, Walter turned to Mason, his expression thoughtful. "You know," Walter began, "back when I was training, there were days I didn't think I could make it. Days I wanted to quit. But I had a buddy named Harlan who kept me going. We'd tell each other, 'You're not quitting today.' And one day at a time, we got through." Mason nodded, the words settling in his chest. "I'll keep that in mind." "Good," Walter said, clapping Mason on the shoulder. "Now get back out there. You've got miles to cover." The tutoring sessions at the community center became Mason's second training ground. Ms. Parker was patient but firm, pushing Mason to tackle problems he would have given up on before. "Let's try this one again," Ms. Parker said, pointing to a particularly tricky algebra problem. Mason groaned but picked up his pencil, determined to figure it out. Step by step, Ms. Parker guided him through the process, explaining where he'd gone wrong and how to fix it. When he finally got the correct answer, Mason felt a surge of pride. "See?" Ms. Parker said with a smile. "You got it. You just have to trust yourself." After the session, Mason stayed behind to thank her. "I didn't think I'd ever understand this stuff," he admitted. "But you make it make sense." Ms. Parker's smile widened. "That's because you're putting in the work, Mason. Don't sell yourself short." Her encouragement stayed with him as he walked home. For the first time in a long time, Mason felt like his dreams were within reach. At school, things were less encouraging. Bryce Tucker hadn't let up. If anything, his taunts had become more relentless. "Hey, Clark," Bryce called out in the cafeteria. "You figure out how to solve for loser yet?" "Oh, wait, you already know the answer." The laughter from Bryce's friend stung, but Mason kept his head down, focusing on his tray of food. He reminded himself of Walter's words, "You're not quitting today." Later that day, during gym class, Coach Daniels announced they'd be running laps. Mason felt a flicker of excitement. Running was something he was getting good at. As they lined up, Bryce sidled up to Mason, a sneer on his face. "What's the matter, Clark? Think you're going to outrun your problems?" Mason didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the track ahead. When the whistle blew, he took off, his legs pumping as he focused on his pace. Bryce tried to keep up, but Mason's training gave him the edge. He pulled ahead, crossing the finish line well before Bryce. "Not bad, Clark," Coach Daniels said, clapping him on the back. "You've been working hard, haven't you?" Mason nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. For once, Bryce's taunts didn't matter. He was too focused on what he'd accomplished. But Bryce wasn't done. As Mason walked back to the locker room, Bryce blocked his path, his expression dark. "Don't think this means anything, Clark. You're still nobody." Mason didn't respond, stepping around Bryce and heading inside. He'd learned that silence was often the best response. That evening, as Mason ran through the neighborhood, he thought about the encounter. Bryce's words still echoed in his mind, but they didn't carry the same weight they once had. Mason was starting to see himself differently, and that made all the difference. Mason's days had settled into a rhythm. Morning runs with Walter's encouragement ringing in his ears, afternoons at school trying to block out Bryce's jeers, and evenings at the community center with Ms. Parker. Progress was slow but steady. Each completed math problem and each lap around the track chipped away at his doubts. At school, teachers began to notice the change. Ms. Williams, his history teacher, stopped him after class one day. "Mason, you've been participating more. I can tell you're putting in the effort," she said, her voice kind. "Keep it up. You're capable of great things." Her words warmed Mason, though they also carried a weight of responsibility. He didn't want to let anyone down, not Joanna, not Walter, and not himself. The community center became a refuge. Ms. Parker had a way of making even the hardest problems feel solvable. One evening, as they worked through a particularly tricky equation, she paused and looked at him thoughtfully. "Mason, have you ever thought about helping Emily with her homework?" she asked. Mason frowned. "I guess I haven't." "Why?" Ms. Parker smiled. "You've come a long way. Teaching her could be a good way to see just how much you've learned, and it might help her feel closer to you." That night, Mason sat at the kitchen table with Emily, going over her spelling words. Her giggles and enthusiasm made the stress of the day melt away. But progress wasn't without setbacks. One afternoon, during gym class, Bryce tried to trip Mason during a relay race. Mason stumbled but caught himself, finishing his leg of the race without falling. Bryce's laughter followed him to the sidelines. "Nice save, Clark. Guess you're getting good at not falling flat on your face," Bryce sneered. Mason clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let Bryce derail him. As Mason left school that day, he found a note stuffed in his locker. "Stop acting like you're better than everyone else, Clark. You're nothing." The words stung, but Mason reminded himself of something Walter had said. People only tear you down when they're scared of what you might become. The Community Fitness Challenge was supposed to be a chance for Mason to shine. Walter and Benjamin had encouraged him to sign up, and Mason had poured weeks of training into preparing. The event was held at the local track, with families and neighbors gathered in the stands. Mason's stomach churned as he lined up at the starting line. He spotted Joanna and Emily sitting with Walter, their cheers helping to steady his nerves. The whistle blew, and Mason took off, his legs carrying him forward with practiced ease. He fell into a rhythm, his mind focused on the finish line. But as he rounded the final curve, Bryce appeared out of nowhere, darting onto the track. Before Mason could react, Bryce stuck out his foot, sending Mason sprawling onto the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Mason scrambled to his feet, his palms scraped and bleeding. He finished the race, but he was dead last. Joanna rushed to him, as soon as it was over, Emily clutching her hand. Walter followed close behind, his expression stormy. "You okay, baby?" Joanna asked, her voice tight with worry. Mason nodded, though his chest ached more than his hands. "Yeah, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. As Bryce smirked at him from the sidelines, Mason felt a swell of anger and humiliation. All his hard work undone in a single moment. That evening, Mason sat on the porch, staring at the sky. Walter joined him, his cane tapping softly against the wooden steps. "Rough day," Walter said simply. Mason nodded, his throat tight. "Feels like all of this is pointless. No matter how hard I try, someone's always going to knock me down." Walter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Kid, let me tell you something. Falling down isn't what defines you. It's what you do when you get back up that matters." Mason didn't respond, but Walter's words stuck with him. That night, Joanna found Mason sitting at the kitchen table, his head resting in his hands. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and steady. "You've been through a lot today," she said softly. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Joanna reached in her purse and pulled out an old envelope. "I wasn't sure if you were ready for this, but I think you need it now." Mason took the envelope, his heart pounding. Inside was another letter from his father. "Dear Mason, life is full of moments that will test you, son. There will be times when you feel like everything is working against you, like no matter how hard you try, you can't win. But I want you to know something. The only true failure is giving up. Every time you get back up, you prove to yourself and to the world that you're stronger than the forces trying to hold you down. You don't have to be the fastest, the strongest, or the smartest. You just have to keep going. That's what makes you a hero. Love, Dad." Tears blurred Mason's vision as he read the words. He folded the letter carefully and held it close to his chest. His father's belief in him felt like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of despair. The next morning, Mason laced up his sneakers and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the world quiet. He started running, his feet pounding against the pavement with renewed determination. As the sun rose, Mason knew he wasn't running away from his struggles, he was running toward his future. The school buzzed with whispers the next day. News of Bryce's stunt at the fitness challenge had spread, and Mason could feel the stares as he walked through the hallways. Some were pitying, others amused, but just a few looked like admiration. As he approached his locker, Bryce was already there, leaning casually against the metal doors with his trademark smirk. "Hey, Clark," Bryce drawled. "How's it feels to eat dirt in front of the whole neighborhood?" Mason ignored him, keeping his focus on his locker combination. "What? Too scared to talk now?" Bryce pressed, stepping closer. "You think running your little charity marathon makes you better than me?" Mason's hand froze, his jaw tightening. He turned slowly, meeting Bryce's gaze for the first time. "I'm not better than anyone," Mason said, his voice steady. "But I'm not worse either. And I'm done letting you make me feel like I am." Bryce's smirk faltered, and for a moment he seemed caught off guard. But then he laughed, his voice loud and mocking. "Yeah? What are you going to do about it, Clark?" Mason straightened, his shoulders square. "Nothing. I'm not going to fight you, Bryce. You can say whatever you want, but I'm not giving you any more power over me." A hush fell over the hallway as students stopped to watch the confrontation. Even Bryce seemed unsure of what to do next. "You're just scared," Bryce spat. "Scared because you know I'm right." "No," Mason said calmly. "I'm not scared of you anymore." The weight of his words hung in the air. Bryce stepped back, his confidence visibly shaken. From the corner of his eye, Mason noticed Chris, one of Bryce's friends, standing nearby. Chris hesitated, then stepped forward. "He's right, Bryce," Chris said quietly but firmly. "You've gone too far. What you did at the challenge was messed up." Bryce whipped around, his face flushing. "What's your problem, Chris?" Chris squared his shoulders, his voice steady. "My problem is you. You're not as tough as you think you are. Maybe it's time you stop tearing people down." The crowd murmured, and Bryce's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth to retort, but then seemed to think better of it. With a final glare at Mason, Bryce stalked off, leaving the hallway buzzing with whispers. Chris turned to Mason, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry for everything. I should have spoken up sooner. Mason nodded, his heart still pounding. Thanks, Chris. For the first time, Mason felt like he wasn't alone. That evening, Mason ran farther than he ever had before. Each step felt lighter, each breath steadier. He thought about Bryce's words, but they no longer carried the same sting. Walter was waiting for him at the park, his cane resting beside him as usual. You look like a kid with something on his mind, Walter said as Mason slowed to a stop. Bryce tried to mess with me today, Mason admitted, wiping the sweat from his brow. But I didn't let him. Walter's face broke into a proud grin. That's what I like to hear. Standing up without swinging fists that takes more guts than you know. Mason sat down beside him, his legs still trembling from the run. I just don't get it. Why is he so set on tearing me down? Walter sighed, leaning back on the bench. Some people can't stand seeing others rise above what they expect of them. Makes them feel small. But that's their problem, not yours. Mason nodded, the words sinking in. He thought about the other kids at school, the ones who had started to notice his progress. Maybe Bryce's taunts weren't the only voices that mattered anymore. You're stronger than you think, kid, Walter said, clapping Mason on the shoulder. Don't forget that. The next morning, Mason woke up early, his alarm buzzing insistently. He turned it off and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the folded letter from his father on the nightstand. His father's words echoed in his mind. The only true failure is giving up. Mason stood, stretching his arms and rolling his shoulders. Today was a new day, a chance to keep building on what he'd started. He laced up his sneakers and stepped outside, the cool morning air sharp against his skin. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Mason took his first steps, each one carrying him closer to his goals. By the time he returned home, the sun was rising, bathing the neighborhood in golden light. Joanna was in the kitchen, her face softening when she saw him. You're up early again, she said, pouring him a glass of water. Mason smiled, taking the glass from her. Gotta be ready for whatever comes next, right? Joanna reached out, resting a hand on his cheek. You've come so far, baby. Your dad would be so proud of you. Her words filled Mason with a quiet strength. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it. The days following Mason's confrontation with Bryce felt lighter. For the first time, the weight of Bryce's bullying didn't press so heavily on his chest. The whispers in the hallways seemed less judgmental, and even teachers started noticing the change in him. Coach Daniels pulled him aside after gym class one day. Mason, I've seen your improvement lately. Keep it up, you've got potential. Mason nodded, the words fueling his determination. However, Bryce wasn't done. One afternoon, as Mason left the community center after a tutoring session, he found Bryce waiting for him outside. Bryce's face was twisted in anger, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're something now, don't you? Bryce snarled. Think you're better than me? Mason stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. No, Bryce. I'm not better than you. I'm just trying to be better than I was yesterday. Bryce stepped closer, his jaw tightening. You're just a loser pretending to be something you're not. Mason took a deep breath, his father's words echoing in his mind. The only true failure is giving up. I'm not pretending, Bryce, Mason said. I'm working. You can too if you want. But I'm not going to let you drag me down. Bryce faltered, his fists unclenching slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, but instead he turned and walked away. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The next morning, Mason woke to the sound of something falling in the kitchen. He rushed out of his room to find Joanna sitting on the floor, clutching her head. Emily stood nearby, her eyes wide with fear. Ma! Mason exclaimed, dropping to his knees beside her. What happened? Joanna waved him off weakly. I'm fine, baby. Just got dizzy for a second. You don't look fine, Mason said, his voice firm. We're going to the doctor. Joanna protested, but Mason wouldn't hear it. With help from a neighbor, they got her to the clinic, where the doctor confirmed what Mason had feared. Joanna was overworked and dangerously exhausted. She needs rest, the doctor said, his tone serious. If she keeps pushing herself, it'll get worse. Mason felt a surge of guilt and helplessness. How could he help her when he was barely keeping himself together? Back at home, Mason sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills. Emily was drawing at the other end of the table, her crayons scattered around her. "Don't worry, Mason," Emily said brightly, holding up a picture of him in a superhero cape. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Her faith in him was both humbling and daunting. Mason clenched his fists, silently promising himself that he wouldn't let her or Joanna down. Determined to take charge, Mason reached out to Walter and Benjamin for help. Walter rallied some neighbors to assist with chores and meals, while Benjamin offered to cover the family's bills for the month. At first, Mason felt a pang of shame accepting so much help. But as he saw the relief on Joanna's face and the joy in Emily's eyes, he realized Walter was right. There was no shame in leaning on others when you needed it. Meanwhile, Mason threw himself into his training. He ran harder, studied longer, and practiced speaking confidently in front of the mirror for his upcoming interview with the military prep program. Walter continued to mentor him, sharing stories of perseverance and strategies for staying focused under pressure. "You've got everything you need to succeed," Walter said one evening as they sat in the park. "You just have to believe it." Mason nodded, the weight of Walter's words settling over him. He thought of his father, of the letter that had pulled him through his lowest moments. "I'm ready," he thought. "I could do this." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. With Joanna confined to bed rest, Mason had to take charge of the household. He woke early to prepare breakfast for Emily, made sure she was ready for school, and still managed to squeeze in his morning runs. By the time he returned home in the afternoons, there was cleaning, cooking, and schoolwork to juggle. But Mason wasn't alone. Walter stopped by daily, sometimes bringing groceries or just sitting with Mason for a few minutes to talk. Miss Parker called in the evenings to check on his studies, offering tips and encouragement. Even their neighbor, Mrs. Andrews, pitched in, watching Emily after school on days Mason stayed late at the community center. One evening, Mason sat on the porch with Walter, who had brought over a thermos of coffee. The cool night air was calming, and the stars seemed brighter than usual. "You're doing good, kid," Walter said, taking a sip from his mug. "It's not easy stepping up the way you have." Mason shook his head. "It doesn't feel like enough. Joanna's still stressed, and I'm barely keeping up with everything." Walter leaned forward, his cane resting against his knee. "Listen, Mason, nobody can do it all, but you've got something a lot of people don't, a community that believes in you. You just have to let them help." Mason nodded slowly, Walter's words settling in his chest like a warm glow. The next day, Mason walked Emily to school, her tiny hand clutching his as they passed the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood. "Mason," Emily said, looking up at him with wide eyes, "do you think you'll be a soldier like Dad?" Mason's throat tightened. He thought about the letter, his father's unwavering belief in him. "I don't know, Em," he said honestly, "but I'm going to try my best." Emily grinned. "You already look like a superhero to me." Her words carried Mason through the day. Mason's training intensified as the date of his military prep program interview drew closer. Benjamin arranged for Mason to meet with a retired officer, Major Arnold, who specialized in coaching applicants. During their first session, Major Arnold studied Mason carefully. "You've got determination," he said, "but determination alone won't get you through the door. Let's see how you handle pressure." The mock interview was grueling. Major Arnold fired off rapid questions, challenging Mason to think on his feet. By the end, Mason's palms were sweaty, and his confidence was shaken. "You've got work to do," Major Arnold said bluntly. "But I've seen worse applicants make it. Show me you can improve." Mason left the session feeling deflated but determined. Each evening after tutoring, he practiced answering interview questions, reciting his responses in front of a mirror. Joanna, still recovering, often sat nearby, offering gentle feedback. "You got a good story to tell, baby," she said one night. "Don't be afraid to let them see who you really are." Mason nodded, her words a balm to his nerves. Meanwhile, at school, Bryce continued to hover on the edges of Mason's life, but his attacks had lost their sting. The hallway whispers had shifted in Mason's favor, with more students quietly supporting him. Chris, once one of Bryce's closest allies, now regularly joined Mason at lunch, sharing jokes and study tips. One afternoon, Bryce cornered Mason near the gym. "Don't think this is over," Bryce said, his voice low and menacing. Mason met his gaze calmly. "I'm not thinking about you, Bryce. I've got better things to focus on." The simplicity of Mason's response seemed to unnerve Bryce. With no one left to cheer him on, Bryce retreated, leaving Mason with a small but satisfying victory. 2 days before his interview, Mason joined Walter for a final session at the park. Walter brought along a pair of old weights and a stopwatch, challenging Mason to a series of exercises. "You're not just preparing your body, kid," Walter said as Mason strained to complete another push-up. "You're preparing your mind. Confidence isn't something you wake up with, it's something you earn." Afterward, they sat on the bench, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "You ready for this?" Walter asked. Mason thought about his runs, the tutoring sessions, the letter from his dad. He thought about Joanna's quiet sacrifices and Emily's unshakable faith in him. "I think I am," Mason said, his voice steady. Walter nodded, a rare look of pride softening his features. "Good. You've got this." That evening, Mason sat with Joanna at the kitchen table, the weight of the upcoming interview pressing down on him. "I'm scared, Ma," he admitted. Joanna reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "It's okay to be scared, Mason. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you don't let the fear stop you." Her words were a reminder of everything Mason had learned over the past few months. He wasn't the same boy who had let pride and fear hold him back. He was stronger now, not just because of what he'd accomplished, but because of the people who had helped him along the way. As he went to bed that night, Mason took out his father's letter and read it one last time. He folded it carefully and placed it under his pillow, a quiet reminder of the man he wanted to become. The morning of Mason's interview arrived quickly, each passing day a whirlwind of preparation. Mason woke early, pulling on his best clothes, a collared shirt and slacks that Joanna had carefully ironed the night before. They weren't new, but they were clean and neat enough to make a good impression. Joanna walked into the room as he adjusted his collar, a soft smile on her face. "You look sharp, baby," she said, smoothing a wrinkle on his sleeve. "Thanks, Ma," Mason said, his voice tight with nerves. She placed her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Remember what we talked about. Be yourself. You've worked hard for this, and they'll see that." Mason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Walter arrived shortly after, his old car rumbling in the driveway. He gave Mason an encouraging nod as he climbed into the passenger seat. The drive to the recruitment office was quiet, the weight of the moment settling heavily over them. When they arrived, Walter parked and turned to Mason. "This is it, kid. Time to show them what you're made of." Mason nodded, his palms sweating as he stepped out of the car. He could see the sign above the building Military Prep Program Recruitment Office, and his heart pounded in his chest. Inside, the receptionist greeted him warmly and directed him to a waiting area. Mason sat down, clutching the portfolio he'd prepared with his academic records and a personal statement. Around him, other applicants sat stiffly, their faces a mix of nerves and determination. "Mason Clark," a man's voice called. Mason stood, his legs trembling slightly as he followed the man down a hallway. They entered a small interview room where 2 men in military uniforms sat behind a table. Their expressions were serious but not unkind. "Take a seat, Mason," one of them said, gesturing to a chair. Mason sat down, gripping his portfolio tightly. The questions came quickly, each one designed to test his character, his determination, and his understanding of what the program required. "Why do you want to join the military prep program?" one of the interviewers asked, his tone neutral. Mason took a deep breath. "I want to make something of myself," he said. "My dad was in the military, and he always believed in courage and doing what's right. I want to follow in his footsteps and prove that no matter where you come from, you can achieve great things if you're willing to work for them." The interviewers exchanged glances, but gave no indication of their thoughts. Another question came. "How have you overcome challenges in your life?" Mason hesitated, then spoke honestly. "There have been times when I didn't think I could keep going. My family struggled a lot since my dad passed, and there were days when it felt like everything was against us. But I've learned that you can't let fear or doubt stop you. I've worked hard to improve my grades, my fitness, and myself. I've had help along the way, and I'm grateful for that, but I know that in the end, it's up to me to keep pushing forward. The interview continued, each question digging deeper into who Mason was and what he hoped to achieve. By the time it ended, Mason felt drained but oddly proud. He told his story honestly, and that was all he could do. One of the interviewers stood, extending a hand. "Thank you, Mason. We'll be in touch soon." Mason shook his hand, thanking him before leaving the room. Walter was waiting in the car when Mason stepped outside, his expression expectant. "Well?" Walter asked as Mason climbed in. "I think it went okay," Mason said, exhaling deeply. "They said they'd be in touch." Walter grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's all you can ask for, kid. You did it." The days that followed were agonizing. Mason threw himself into his routines to distract himself from the waiting. He ran every morning, studied every evening, and continued helping Joanna and Emily with their daily tasks. At school, the atmosphere felt different. Bryce had grown quieter, his usual taunts replaced with sullen glances. Chris often joined Mason at lunch, their conversations ranging from sports to homework. "You know," Chris said one day, "it's kind of cool what you're doing. Not a lot of people would stick with it like you have." Mason shrugged, embarrassed but grateful. "Thanks. I want to make my family proud." "You're doing that," Chris said simply. One evening, as Mason sat at the kitchen table reviewing math problems, the phone rang. Joanna answered, her expression shifting as she listened. "Mason, it's for you," she said, holding the receiver out with a smile that hinted at good news. Mason's heart raced as he took the phone. "Hello. This is Captain Reynolds from the military prep program," the voice on the other end said. "I'm calling to inform you that you've been accepted into the program." "Congratulations, Mason." Mason's breath caught, his vision blurring with tears. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." After the call ended, Mason turned to Joanna, his face breaking into a grin. "I got him, I did it." Joanna pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud." Emily burst into the room, her face alight with excitement. "Does this mean you're going to be a soldier like Dad?" Mason knelt down, pulling her into the hug. "It means I'm one step closer, Em." That evening, the house was filled with laughter and joy. Walter stopped by to celebrate, bringing cupcakes from the bakery down the street. As they sat around the kitchen table, Mason felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. "You've come a long way, kid," Walter said, raising his cupcake in a mock toast. "And this is just the beginning." Mason smiled, his heart full. For the first time, the future felt bright. The morning after Mason's acceptance into the military prep program, the house felt lighter, almost as if the weight of the past few months had lifted. Joanna hummed softly as she prepared breakfast, and Emily drew pictures of Mason in a uniform, beaming with pride. But Mason knew the journey was far from over. If anything, this was just the beginning. As he laced up his sneakers for his morning run, Walter was already waiting for him outside, leaning on his cane with a wide grin. "Figured you'd still be floating on that cloud," Walter teased. Mason grinned. "Guess I gotta run it off." Walter chuckled. "That's the right attitude, kid. But remember, it's not about proving yourself anymore. You've earned your spot. Now, it's about staying true to what got you here." As Mason started his run, he reflected on Walter's words. The acceptance wasn't the finish line, it was the starting point of something bigger. Mason's first stop after his run was the community center. Miss Parker greeted him at the door, her face lighting up as soon as she saw him. "Good morning, Mason. You look like a boy with good news," she said, her hands on her hips. "I got in," Mason said, the words still feeling surreal as they left his mouth. Miss Parker clapped her hands together, her smile widening. "Mason, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." They sat down at one of the tables, and Mason told her about the interview. Miss Parker listened intently, occasionally nodding or laughing at Mason's self-deprecating humor about his nervousness. "You know," she said when he finished, "I've always believed in you. You've worked so hard for this, and you've earned every bit of it. Don't ever forget that." Her words filled Mason with gratitude. He'd started this journey thinking he had to do it all alone, but people like Miss Parker had made it possible. Later that day, Mason stopped by the diner where Joanna worked. She had taken a light shift that day, much to Mason's relief, and her co-workers were thrilled to hear the news. "Your mom's been bragging about you for weeks," one of them said with a grin. Joanna blushed but didn't deny it. "I can't help it," she said, pulling Mason into a hug. "He's my boy, and he's going places." Mason smiled, feeling the pride in her voice like a warm embrace. That evening, Mason sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the air was cool and still. Joanna joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. "Feels like a good night," Joanna said, settling into the chair beside him. Mason nodded. "It does." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of everything they'd been through lingering but not heavy. "You know," Joanna said softly, "your dad would be so proud of you." Mason's throat tightened. He looked out at the horizon, his father's words from the letter echoing in his mind. "I hope so," he said quietly. Joanna reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know so. He always believed in you, Mason. And now, you're proving him right." The days leading up to Mason's departure for the military prep program were filled with preparation. Benjamin helped Mason secure everything he'd need for the program, from uniforms to supplies. Walter gave him pointers on discipline and staying focused, sharing stories of his own training days. Emily grew more attached in those final days, clinging to Mason's side every chance she got. "Are you going to come home a lot?" she asked one evening as they sat on the floor drawing together. "I'll come home as much as I can," Mason promised. Emily looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I'm going to miss you, Mason." Mason hugged her tightly, his own throat tightening. "I'll miss you too, Em, but I'm doing this for us, for you and Mom." When the day finally came, Mason stood in the doorway of their small house, his bag packed and slung over his shoulder. Joanna and Emily stood beside him, both trying to keep their emotions in check. Walter's car idled in the driveway, ready to take Mason to the bus station. "You've got this, baby," Joanna said, pulling him into a tight hug. Mason held her for a moment, letting her words settle in his heart. Then he knelt down to hug Emily, who clung to him fiercely. "You're my superhero," she whispered. Mason smiled, his voice steady. "And you're mine, Em." As the car pulled away, Mason looked back at his family, standing on the porch, waving. He felt a pang of sadness, but also a surge of determination. He wasn't just leaving for himself, he was leaving for them. The bus ride to the military prep program was long and quiet, giving Mason plenty of time to think. As he stared out the window at the rolling countryside, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was the moment he'd been working toward, but it also felt like stepping into the unknown. When the bus pulled into the academy's campus, Mason's breath caught. The grounds were expansive with neatly trimmed lawns, tall flagpoles, and rows of uniformed cadets marching in perfect formation. He stepped off the bus, clutching his bag tightly as he joined a small group of new recruits. "Welcome to the Military Preparatory Academy," boomed a stern voice. Mason turned to see a tall man in uniform, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. "I'm Sergeant Halston, and I'll be overseeing your orientation." The next few hours were a blur of introductions, rules, and assignments. Mason was given a bunk in a shared dormitory and a schedule packed with physical training, academic classes, and leadership exercises. As he unpacked his bag that evening, he placed his father's letter on the small shelf by his bed. It was a reminder of why he was here and who he was doing this for. The first week was grueling. Mason struggled to keep up with the rigorous physical training, his muscles aching from early morning runs and intense drills. The academic workload was just as demanding, with classes on history, strategy, and problem solving. One particularly challenging day, the recruits were tasked with completing an obstacle course. Mason hesitated at the high wall, his hands trembling as he reached for the rope. "Clark," barked Sergeant Halston, "get over that wall. Now!" Mason took a deep breath, focusing on Walter's advice. One step at a time. He gripped the rope tightly and pulled himself up, his arms straining as he climbed. When he reached the top, he paused for a moment, looking down at the ground below. "You're almost there," shouted one of his fellow recruits, a boy named Ryan, who had been the first to finish. Mason nodded, forcing himself to keep moving. He swung his leg over the wall and slid down the other side, his heart pounding as his feet hit the ground. "Good work, Clark," Sergeant Halston said, his tone slightly softer. "Now keep moving." By the end of the course, Mason was exhausted but proud. He'd pushed past his fear and proven to himself that he could handle the challenges. As the weeks passed, Mason began to form bonds with his fellow recruits. Ryan, the confident and quick-witted boy who had cheered him on during the obstacle course, became a close friend. They spent their free time studying together, sharing stories about their families, and motivating each other during training. One evening, as they sat on the dormitory steps watching the sunset, Ryan turned to Mason. "You're different, Clark," he said. "Most of us came here because we wanted to prove something to ourselves. But you, it's like you're doing this for more than just you." Mason hesitated, then nodded. "I am. My family's been through a lot, and I want to show them that all the hard work and sacrifices weren't for nothing." Ryan grinned, clapping Mason on the back. "Well, you're doing it, man. Keep it up." Their friendship became a source of strength for Mason, reminding him that he wasn't alone in his journey. One quiet evening, Mason sat at his desk in the dormitory, a piece of paper in front of him. He hadn't written to Joanna or Emily since arriving at the academy, and he wanted them to know how he was doing. "Dear Mom and Emily, I hope this letter finds you well. Things here are tough, but I'm learning so much. Every day feels like a new challenge, but I'm taking it one step at a time, just like Walter said. The training is harder than I expected, but I'm getting stronger. There are moments when I want to give up, but then I think about you too and everything you've done for me. That's what keeps me going. Emily, I hope you're still drawing. I miss seeing your pictures. And Mom, I hope you're resting like the doctor told you to. You've done so much for me, and now it's my turn to make you proud. Thank you both for believing in me. I won't let you down. Love, Mason." Mason sealed the letter and placed it in the outgoing mail, a sense of peace washing over him. The final week of the first term was marked by a leadership assessment. Each recruit was assigned a team and given a mission to complete a simulated rescue operation that required strategy, communication, and teamwork. Mason's team struggled at first, with clashing opinions and miscommunication slowing their progress. But Mason remembered Walter's advice. Confidence isn't something you wake up with, it's something you earn. He stepped up, assigning roles and encouraging his teammates to stay focused. "We can do this," he said, his voice steady. "Let's work together." Under Mason's leadership, the team completed the mission just before the deadline. "That's what I like to see," Sergeant Halston said, nodding at Mason. "Leadership under pressure. Keep it up, Clark." As Mason stood with his team, watching the sun set over the academy grounds, he felt a quiet pride. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. 6 months later, Mason stood at the gates of the academy, his uniform crisp and his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The first term had come to an end, and recruits were allowed a week-long break to return home. As the bus pulled into Mason's neighborhood, he felt a swell of emotion. The streets looked the same, cracked sidewalks and familiar houses with chipped paint, but Mason felt like a different person. Joanna and Emily were waiting on the porch, their smiles wide as Mason stepped off the bus. Emily ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Mason!" she cried, her voice filled with excitement. "Hey," Mason said, lifting her off the ground. Joanna approached, her eyes misty as she pulled Mason into a hug. "Look at you," she said, her voice trembling. "You look so grown up." Mason smiled. "It's good to be home, Ma." That evening, the house was filled with warmth and laughter. Walter and Ms. Parker stopped by to celebrate, bringing a cake and sharing stories about Mason's journey. "You've done good, kid," Walter said, raising a cup of coffee and a toast. "You've made us all proud." Mason nodded, his heart full. The road ahead was still long, but this moment felt like a victory worth savoring. Later that night, after everyone had left, Mason sat in his room, the letter from his father resting on the nightstand. He picked it up, the edges worn from countless readings, and unfolded it carefully. His father's words were as powerful as ever, a reminder of the courage and determination that had carried Mason through his darkest moments. But this time, Mason didn't feel the same weight of expectation. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence, a belief that he was on the right path. Mason took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Dad, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I wanted to write it anyway. Your letter gave me strength when I needed it most, and I want you to know that I've been doing my best to live up to the person you believed I could be. I got into the military prep program. It's tough, but I'm learning so much. I've made friends, pushed past my limits, and started to believe in myself the way you believed in me. Mom and Emily are doing well. Emily still draws pictures of me as a superhero, and Mom smiles more now. I think they're proud of me, and that means everything. Thank you for your words, Dad. They've been my guide, and I carry them with me every day. Love, Mason. Mason folded the letter carefully and placed it next to his father's. He lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling, a sense of peace settling over him. The journey wasn't over, but Mason knew he was ready for whatever came next.